The future of professional selling is
effective coaching and leadership,
virtual communication,
effective selling to new generation customers,
remote sales forces.
Sales as a service, selling Canadian real estate to Chinese buyers.
So I guess, well, great video by you guys. My first question would just be like, how would it differ in terms of like either like the U.S. or Canadian government versus like an African government? Did you give me sort of perspective? Just because I imagine it's a bit different.
Yeah. Honestly, we didn't interview the African government, but I'd assume that it's probably a lot more complex in Canada and the States just because of probably their regulations and the layers of government. So I mean, the government is a very complex customer when compared to selling to a corporation, for example. So that would probably be the biggest difference.
That would probably be the biggest thing, I think, is regulations.
I think it's interesting selling to the government just because it is such a formal process, as you guys mentioned. So a lot of selling is normally based on, I guess, personal relationships you have, but do you think that's as important in a case like this, or is it, would you say it's mostly based on like the R&D and like your actual product as opposed to like schmoozing kind of?
And so it's changed a lot in the last few years, is our understanding. So once upon a time, relationships mattered a lot more. And I guess it varies from project to project, but our understanding now, at least, is that relationships don't have as big an effect, and it's basically on that R&D, on the credentials of the company itself, and not necessarily just schmoozing.
Yeah. So being able to like market yourself is probably pretty important. If you can market your solution well, then you probably fare better in the eyes of the customer.
I have a question. You mentioned the importance of the capture team leader and the credentials of the capture team. Can you provide some advice to an organization, maybe not Talus, but another competitor, about what kinds of compensation systems would make sense for that capture team?
So I guess the biggest thing of that is essentially how well you're able to do your job in that sense. So I guess a large percentage of that would be how much prep you're putting into this and how much time you're actually spending on a customer. So in terms of that, to answer your question, how a compensation system should work for something like this. Unfortunately, we didn't probe too much of that. We only had a short period of time, but I think that based off this, it should be based off a bonus. It should be if you actually win that deal, because they are pretty large contracts, so essentially tying a lot more of the compensation to an actual victory in that case, I think would be most appropriate.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what the compensation system is, but like in your industry, there's like already a lot of motivation just because the government only spends so much on defense. So like you're motivated by that because you know you need to bring in a certain amount of contracts, or you might not have a job in a couple of years.
Okay, just one follow-up to that. It was interesting in the discussion there about the importance of a relationship. And you guys also said that it's critical to get the RFP before it actually arrives. And I would think then that capture team leaders, those relationships they have with those key people and the various members of the buying team are the things that get them in there before other companies. So can you reconcile that for me, how relationships are increasingly not as important, but you need to be able to get there early?
So I was addressing that question in terms of actually schmoozing and taking out for dinner and this and that, and I think the level of that has gone down a little bit. But in terms of actually having relationships with people, knowing who they are, essentially being in industry, Jerry's been in there for a while, so he knows all the people that they've got, like, who will be making these deals, so he is aware of when these sorts of things are coming about months and months before there's even any talk. And then usually actually in one of our other Q&A things, we actually have something, they actually have something called Industry Day, which a lot of people, all the people that are interested will attend, all the major players will attend, and essentially that is basically when they do release some of the details of the RFP itself.
Yeah, no, the way I interpreted the question was that I think marketing and relationships are actually more important than the solution. So being able to sell the solution is paramount. And for someone like Jerry, he has a lot of credibility in the industry, so he does really well.
How are we doing for time?
5 minutes.
Oh. Any other questions? Yeah?
How do you think technology is going to change the way that you guys, there'll be pre-love shooting deals like in the future?
Well, like I said, so there was a bid that kind of came to life while I was there one summer, and it like filled a moving van basically by the time it was done, so it was all on paper. So I think that will completely change. The summer that I was there, we looked at systems to streamline the bid management process, just because it actually is so time consuming just to edit an RFP, for example, or a submission of a bid. So I think that could be a big area where you could see some improvements. Yeah, yes.
I have another question. It's interesting how the government's moving to away from just cheapest, most compliant bid to a point system that allows you to build a record of your performance over time, and that may help you in future bids. So given that they're moving in that direction, and that the government is very transparent about what those criteria are, can you talk to me about how a salesperson or capture team leader who learns and understands that can help the marketing function do a better job within the organization, whether it's in defining product development or otherwise?
Right. So for example, if like R&D was a big criteria of the government, then maybe instead of pushing like another decision criteria, they would market their R&D product instead.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. So essentially just being aware of what they're really valuing in that project and making sure you're pushing that aspect whenever you're dealing or have a touch point with the person making the decision.
Thank you.
Our government's looking at whether these bids that they've given out, or I mean, I guess like the contracts they have, are they measuring whether they're providing what they promise, and how are they, if they are doing so, how are they doing that? Does that make sense?
So like when they release an RFP and then a company bids?
Yeah, so say a company's won the contract, how is the government measuring whether that company is fulfilling the contract, and if they are doing so, how are they doing it?
So like listed in the RFP, there'll be several requirements that the company is like contracted to, like they have to follow them. They'll also sometimes do rounds of funding. So for example, you have to fulfill the first round criteria or obligations before you can get your second round of funding from the government. So that is also probably a way that they keep track and make sure that the company is aligned. And I guess if there were issues maybe with the first round, for example, they could send out another RFP for rounds to come. But generally, they're like binded by that contract.
With in regards to the bidders, is that how do you get the information, like in regards to who the bidders are and even just what they're offering? Like, does the government help provide that, or do you actually have to hire someone to specifically kind of knows their way to get the information to the competitors?
So Thales, for example, they would attend an industry day where they'd probably find out who's most likely to bid, and then just, I guess, using their business network, they'll be able to figure out who are like the top contenders. And I think, like Jerry kind of said, that there was usually only 2 or 3 competitors that you're really worried about. Like if you've been in the industry for 20 years, you're pretty sure of what your competitors' strengths are. So I think that's a way of kind of figuring it out, but it's definitely not explicit. Like the government's pretty transparent, but I don't think they'll release who's actually bidding. So it's up to you to kind of leverage your network to find out that information.
How does the government decide who they're sending the RFP to?
Yeah, so that again is it's transparent, it's public knowledge. So there's a database called Mercs, for example, and a company like Thales will go on and they'll surf Mercs on a daily or a weekly basis to see which RFPs are being released for what industry. I don't know if the government, if there's ever like a specific instance where the government would approach a company directly just because they feel like they have a great solution. But generally it's public knowledge and the companies can go on and track RFPs.
It's like an unlimited amount of companies could bid, technically.
Technically, yeah, but they make it so the requirements are pretty tough for a small company to bid, for example. And they usually go with people that they're trusted.
Any questions?
So do you see some of the innovation coming from smaller businesses, like startups or larger organizations?
So you can see like some companies like Salesforce, like right now they have their current like hackathon right now where they have like all these engineers and programmers who come and try to come up with new programs and stuff like that. There's $1 million prize. So a lot of these bigger companies are focusing on doing that, but I think a lot of the smaller companies have compelling stories moving forward and we should talk about those.
Yeah, so when we're looking at, in terms of the smaller companies, I think one of the sort of trends here is just consolidation. So speaking to David Kramer, like a big sort of the aspect here is that when you look at some of these smaller startups, they have a very good product that's focusing on one facet of CRM, whether it's sort of the marketing aspect, whether it's on lead management. And what's really happening is you have these larger companies who are just going to buy up the smaller players, then integrate it into their own companies, so that overall they can still have a more comprehensive suite to address for sales managers and account execs. Because having like 10 different tools, although if they're best in class in each of different areas, it's still sort of a pain in the butt to manage. So I think that's sort of the trend. And when you look at a company like Salesforce, I think they've made about 29 acquisitions since 2006. Like, there's definitely a lot of activity there. Yeah.
So according to you, which industries benefit the most from the CRM system?
Overall, I'd say it definitely, like specifically like sectors. I think sort of it definitely have to be business to business sort of organizations. That's sort of where the main focus is. I think technology is certainly an area for that when you're dealing with a company like Oracle selling hardware, software. I think there's a lot of value there. I think whether it'll generally be looking at sort of longer and complex things. Like I think something like the government, something like that, I think would involve sort of when you're dealing with a lot of data, a lot of touch points, a lot of different contacts. I think generally the more complex sales cycle you're looking at, the more value CRM can provide.
I got a question. So we see this trend happening where arguably salespeople are going to have access to a lot more information. And that means they're going to have to do more analysis. But what we find in lots of organizations, those strong analytical skills are not something salespeople have. So what advice do you have for a sales manager who now has access to this but doesn't have people with the capabilities to leverage it?
Yeah, sure, good question. I think the thing here is, in terms of the role of the sales manager and what they have to do in this process, is that they have to choose the information that's relevant within specific cases. I know from one of our interviews we spoke to is just they were really running experimentation around the timing in which they were addressing how quickly people would sign up for the service online, how quickly you would do the outreach. So you're running tests in terms of that. So I think it's a sales manager's job to determine what sort of data is important and how they plan on gathering it, and then how they plan on sort of implementing it. And I think technology certainly plays a role in that. Like we mentioned sort of the trend of the voice of the consumer and just aggregating all this different information. Like I think a salesperson can really benefit from seeing outstanding support tickets when they're talking to a certain customer, but they need to, I think the sales manager has to ensure they have the right data, and the technology services they do choose can basically summarize the data in a convenient fashion, do the analysis for them, so that it basically presents the most relevant view to the salesperson.
I have another question. So CRM is a bunch of things, and one of the areas that I see significant investment in beyond the whole social media side is in marketing automation. Can you talk to me a little bit about how marketing automation is a component of CRM, and maybe some examples from your interviews and the like that convey the return on investment when spending what oftentimes is a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of risk in a marketing automation tool, of which Salesforce.com has some.
Yeah, I think a lot of sales managers aren't aware of the benefits that something like this can offer them. And they're used to doing something one way that's worked for them. But yeah, there's a huge return on investment that is kind of not really quantifiable at first. It's more of an experience sort of thing, right? So being able to just have information at your fingertips as opposed to filing through your papers and that sort of thing. One of the other things we spoke about was knowing when your meetings are and getting a reminder about past email history with someone and LinkedIn profile. That's really hard to quantify what that adds to your bottom line, but it's more the experience that it adds and makes it easier. And longer term, that will lead to higher sales conversion, doing a lot better with your customers. But I think at first it's hard to quantify that, and I think that's the issue of marketing it. But I guess showing more of the features and the benefits is kind of the way to go in terms of marketing as opposed to kind of showing numbers really, because it's kind of tough to quantify, I think.
And just to touch on in terms of the vendors who are sort of already in here, I think we have Marketo is sort of a big provider of this. We haven't seen much consolidation in terms of core CRM and the marketing automation side. I think that's yet to come. But I know there's definitely a lot of the CRMs do have a lot of plugins and a lot of sort of integration features with these external sort of applications focusing on marketing. So like, I know one thing that in our reviews they mentioned was like drip campaigns. So like sales people are constantly reaching out, they're assessing whether the lead is qualified or not, and sometimes it's just not the right time. So in their CRM, they can put that person into a bucket to be on a drip campaign, and then the marketing automation can take care of that in terms of nurturing that lead just through like sort of a low touch way.
I just want to say you guys did a good presentation. I did the same topic. I agree with all the benefits that you guys identified in terms of the future of CRM. I'm just wondering if you put any thought into what some of the barriers would be in terms of, I don't want to give them away, but barriers you think might be in place that might prevent us from actually reaching the future.
So yeah, some of the barriers, I guess, moving forward, I think are, like as Professor mentioned, it was tough to market it, right? So a lot of companies, they have certain things in place, and it's really hard to change the entire way they do business. So if we're trying to sell this to a business that's a complex sales model, they already have probably a complex way of doing things, which means it's more of a cost to change them. So I think that's the biggest barrier is not only the cost associated with it, but getting everyone on board with it. Perhaps other things.
One of the things is just the amount of data that's currently stored in these. Like making a transition from one provider to another is just horrible. What you're really looking at is so many of the things, especially when you're switching. I know I got to see two sort of different instances of Salesforce. Same data, but the way you can customize it and then further integrating that data into one it's just horrendous. So among different vendors, I think that's a big barrier there in terms of the investment, the time you have to do. Like if they had like 4 months planned for just this implementation of data between the same system. So that's sort of a big barrier. And I think in terms of innovation and further development, I think it's going to depend a lot on sort of the health of the U.S. economy. When the tech bubble bursts, that could definitely cause an issue there.
How are we doing for time, David?
1 more minute.
Any other questions? Question? You think about I think you mentioned voice of customer. We think about the amount of data that's now being captured. You talked about a very granular piece, someone making a Twitter post or otherwise. Is the advantage shifting even more so to large companies who have the resources to invest in the capture of all that and potentially the analytical resources to devote to driving insight from it, to the extreme point that they're going to really make it difficult for small companies to compete? What do you think about where this is going? Or is it the flip argument? Small companies are going to be able to access this and be able to respond more competitively. Where do you think it is on that spectrum?
I think it's just a matter of timing. So I think when we start out, when we're looking at sort of develop, we're going to see larger companies who do have the resources to pursue these sort of technologies. They're going to have the advantage. But I think as more and more investment gets put into these offerings, it's going to sort of filter down. Like, big data is just sort of a large trend that's sort of impacting things, and I think it's only really sort of making an impact on larger organizations right now. But as more intuitive solutions are sort of being developed, I think we are going to see offerings that are going to sort of level the playing field among smaller and larger companies. Okay, thanks for your time, guys.
Sure. Oh, sorry. I don't know. Really excited. What was I gonna ask? All right. So QBF Pi was this weekend, so we had a lot of big people in, senior management, and so a lot of the topic of conversation was social media and how they think it affects their businesses. And a lot of them were saying that they actually think that it's kind of a trend, and it's something that's going to fizzle out. So do you guys think that this is really something that's super important that companies really need to focus on and really spend all this time and money training their salespeople on?
Okay. I think I would disagree and say I don't think it's really a trend. If you look at Facebook and Twitter, I don't see that going away anytime soon, especially and probably a lot of the companies that you were speaking with in like a B2C way. And I think maybe people would have that question again about B2B, is it just a trend? But I think the fact is that more and more salespeople are spending time all day online at their computers. Like, they're not just walking around on their phones anymore with conversations. A lot of it is FaceTime at the computer. So in that way, I think that's just sort of where you're going to find your clients, is online. Just with so many different parts of the business transferring to online, even with something like CRM, like, you're always at your computer now, and so I think that's going to be a key way to find where your buyers are.
Definitely, and I think most of the social media use comes at the very beginning of the buying process, and in finding those initial clients, so prospecting for new clients, and also updating your current clients to see if they're making changes to their online profiles, so that you know how to best adapt as a salesperson.
Do you see any disadvantages associated with the social media and sales?
Definitely. I think in terms of employee training, not a lot of employees will know how to use social media appropriately, especially in a professional setting. I know a lot of people have individual profiles or personal profiles, but it's very different the way you want to post online on behalf of the company. So I think that's definitely something that one of the reasons why corporations will need to have good training programs for their employees and really be up to date for every sales manager.
And of course, like we said, it's on an individual basis. You know, there are some sales reps who might be more prone to getting distracted by the technologies as opposed to being productive with it. So I think, again, that's something to always be cautious of, you know, having certain policies, deciding what percentage of your time should be spent online so that it's not sort of just a break from their everyday work to go cruise Twitter.
Hey, good job, guys. Recently, JP Morgan actually tried a Twitter as an initiative, and they said, ask JP Morgan anything. And it worked terribly. And then afterwards, they said, well, that went well. On Twitter, tweeted that. So JP Morgan did that. Yeah, TV is really good. My question is basically, how can you decipher when social media is good for a company and when it's bad? Or maybe JP Morgan fully trained, maybe that's the answer, I don't know. And how can you distinguish when it's good or when it's bad?
I think it would be good for companies, again, that operate in an industry where they have professionals working there who know the space and who know how to behave appropriately on the space. I think, like we mentioned, having sort of a social media policy as an organization is really important, and that extensive research is done before you just say, we're going to start a Twitter page. Like, you need to know, are your competitors on Twitter, are your potential customers on Twitter, so that you know that it's going to be meaningful to invest all that. I think, yeah, again, so we focus on companies in a high-tech sales industry just because we knew that that would be an industry that it would be relevant for. So I think in B2B, like, a technology company firm would be the most suited for this.
And again, like, JP Morgan asking "Ask Me Anything" is not exactly the proper etiquette. Personally, I don't believe. And based on all the tweets that they got, I would keep
So you mentioned in the video that there was an infographic based around the best ways to train your employees on social media. In your opinion, what do you think is the best way?
So you mentioned splitting your company into different groups because nowadays you'll have salespeople who are fresh out of places like Queens who have spent 4 years on Facebook and really know how to navigate the space. And you'll also have the legacy salespeople who are like 50 years old and just like don't want anything to do with social media. So I think it's important to focus on tailoring the training to each distinct group. And so for people who know social media, it's talking to them about how to measure ROI. If you're getting their input and asking for their influence over other people in the organization, whereas with someone who has never used Facebook before, it's just talking about the benefits. So I think you really have to cater the training to each specific group, but then again have an overarching social media policy that is sort of on behalf of everyone. And in terms of actually doing the training, what we found was that some companies would bring in a social media expert to sort of talk about these things, but that's again really if the company didn't have anyone who grew up on or is savvy in this sort of technology. And most of the research we found said that it was best to do it internally and have an internal champion instead of just bringing in a consulting, like a social media consultant, because you don't really know, they don't know their company, your company as well as you do.
So I just think one thing with like social media is just it's on some like short attention span. So like, although you could have like a salesperson like looking at like tweets and like sort of see sentiment around the product, like oh like Kim Kardashian tweets. So like, how do you think like a lot of time is wasted on these sites?
I think one of the things you mentioned is that the return on investment is a bit difficult to measure, and that's something that a lot of companies have admitted. But through using those sites that measure social media, like Post and Hootsuite and LinkedIn Sales Navigator, you can really see how many posts are leading to conversations and how many clicks are leading to conversations. And I think that the social, you can also categorize all of your postings on one platform. So I think that those tools sort of, help with the short attention span becoming a longer term sort of initiative for an organization.
I was just looking for some clarification. What you're saying in your video seems to be really applicable to like in general to companies. So what about what you're saying is actually specific to a high-tech company that would be different from what any other company on social media would do? Like you're saying it's all about high-tech. So like what about that was actually specific to high-tech?
Right, so like the contact that we worked with was someone, a senior client exec at a company that did a lot of cloud. They basically had a bunch of different cloud products that they were selling to small to medium-sized businesses. And although we don't explicitly state it, the video was sort of made for them. And so I think the areas that I would say are specific for that sort of firm would be more on the blogging aspect of it, which we didn't get into too much detail with because we did want to keep it a little bit general, but blogging to show reviews of your products and really to show that you have a technical knowledge. So in something like this, you want to be able to differentiate based on your knowledge. So you know the most out of all your competitors. You can really help understand like the technical parts. And so blogging is a great way to show that knowledge, and you can write paragraphs instead of just like 120 characters in a tweet as a blast message. You can really cater to different groups.
And further, you can post things like white papers online and tweet about them to get the awareness out to other businesses. Also, as mentioned in the TD video, high-tech, there is a trend of high-tech companies using online tools more frequently. So that's, again, social media does tend to trend to the technology sector.
This isn't really so specific to the tech industry, but just sort of sales in general. Is there any fear that encouraging your salespeople to be online on social media is going to, I guess, decrease the quality of the relationships that they're able to create? Just in terms of, people are spending their entire days on the computer. Can that really replace, I guess, the old school mentality of really going, knocking on doors and talking to people face to face?
That's actually one of the questions that we did address. And there's not, like you said, there's nothing better than like a handshake to close the deal at the end. And I think that a lot of the social media tools come at the beginning of the buying process. So So that's just to set up those initial meetings, and those meetings would be face-to-face. So yes, you're right. I think at the beginning of the process, you're online a lot, but it does lead to a face-to-face meeting.
And that was the exact feedback we got when we sent it to our executive company who was sponsoring us. It was, he said, you know, I agree with your point in the Q&A that nothing replaces a handshake or a coffee in person with someone.
Any questions?
What are some of the drawbacks of contests while they're happening, and how do you mitigate those?
Sorry.
So your question was, what are some of the drawbacks of the contest while they're happening? I think that primarily a lot of the drawbacks are what happens if a sales contest is not run properly. So for example, if they're designed to be too long, too lengthy a period of time, then people don't get, their attention spans are kind of a bit short. Say a contest is through an entire year, 12 months. Salespeople might not be motivated by the third or fourth month anymore, just because the goal is so far away. And as such, when you run these things, then you have to spend a certain amount of money on the prize itself, right? And if you're not getting a positive impact for that, you're actually losing, you're having a negative impact as you're increasing your costs of running these contests, but you're not getting a good return. And an example that Moira had is, what if a contest was, or one of the sales reps was so far ahead of his colleagues or her colleagues, and that the other employees just become demotivated. In that case, by having this competitive nature, you might be actually decreasing the motivation level within the company rather than increasing it as you would.
And one way we found to address that concern is to not have one winner take all, but maybe 75% of people win, or there's certain objectives for each individual, and like depending on where their skill set is, they know that this is achievable, and if I increase my effort levels for the sales contest, that they are going to be able to reach that reward. So it's worthwhile.
Are there any customer service concerns with sales contests? Because, I mean, salespeople are already under a lot of pressure, and then this contest might just drive them to really just focus on the, you know, the revenue aspect rather than the relationship aspect. Is there any, how do you sort of deal with it?
We did come across that in some of our research. In that saying, the assumption is that through a sales contest, perhaps a sales representative might be focused solely on driving sales. And as a result, they might be neglecting a little bit in terms of the relationship. This does have the potential of happening. So it really comes down to how the contest is designed again. And I think that's one of the two key points from our video. The first one is how well are they designed? And secondly, if they are designed well, do they even work anyways? But let's just remain on the first one still. If they're designed well, hopefully it will be so that you can encourage not necessarily sales, but perhaps you can encourage other behaviors, such as encouraging reaching out to new prospects or just building relationships with a current lead. It doesn't necessarily have to be the final sale itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
My question actually is identical to Tim's, but I have another one. In regards to tracking the process of the sales contest, do you have any metrics you recommend other than just sales revenue? Just like speaking from personal experience, I know we've had sales contests and they're quite corrupt. In one way, what we'll do is we'll log in and actually do sales all under one person in the store, so that one person gets way ahead. Right, so is there any way to make metrics just to make sure that the contest isn't like demoralizing or other regards to sales representatives?
I think the key to the contest is setting the objectives correct. So it doesn't always have to be for revenues like Samuel was stating. It could be lead generation, it could be building quality relationships. It's whatever the sales manager and the sales team is trying to improve for the future. Is that just...
I guess if you really wanted to cheat, there's not much that can stop you. But that comes down to, I guess, how unified your sales force is, right? Do they all like kind of hate each other and just kind of want to beat each other, or do they want to work collectively as a team? And I think as sales managers, you would want the latter. You do want some level of competition, but you don't want it to be cutthroat, whereas it negatively impacts your business.
sure that's not happening throughout the sales contest, if that makes sense?
People are not cheating.
Not just even that they're still like collaborating or doing what the regular business activities you're hoping for.
I think, well, I don't see the downfall of like collaboration if it means an overall better result for the whole sales team and each person is gaining more of whatever the certain objective is. It would be to benefit the whole group.
I guess in the example that you gave in that everyone signed into one account and gave that person all the credit for the work, then I guess the other people who are participating kind of looks bad. Because it would mean that they're kind of doing no work during the period. And I think if you're a sales manager and you see that, you would ask, why are we not doing any work? Is this person a cost for a company, should they be let go? Or is there some underlying issues that have to be addressed? So I think if they do collaborate, sorry, go ahead.
I kind of worked my question on there, just more in, was a good answer, just more metrics in regards to making sure that other activities, rather than just the bottom line revenue, or that is being occurred or accomplished during the
Right, and that's why we found out like the duration is really important, because if you're running it for a full year, that's what they're going to be focusing on for the full year, because you've set out the objectives and you've promoted it. So if you keep it to a good time frame, we found out 6 weeks is pretty good to incent those behaviors. That will really get the point across.
Awesome, thanks.
Can you guys offer some suggestions about how you would embed into a compensation plan all those things that a sales contest might enable?
Sir, can you kind of clarify that?
So instead of thinking it from the perspective of these one-off contests or even planned contests, can you comment about how you could use compensation to achieve the same outcome?
That's actually one of my beliefs, in that sales contests might not be the most effective thing. In that you can, as Jun just said, you can put all these things within a regular compensation plan. You can be like, if you are able to be competent in this area, if you're able to generate this many leads, if you're able to make this many sales, then you should be rewarded not necessarily throughout the contest period, but perhaps with a promotion, perhaps you get to manage a couple of other sales reps and kind of take a little bit of royalties from their sales. We looked at an article from the Harvard Business Review that actually outlined a few of these recommendations, and it said you don't necessarily need to use sales contests, but there are different ways of kind of motivating the sales force just on a continual basis, as opposed to just during a certain period of time, because they might be motivated during a certain period of time, but then do they become unmotivated when the contest is running? But if it's part of the regular compensation package, then you can ensure that the effort level is more constant.
Just to follow on to that, can you comment about how you would use sales contests to develop a certain culture among your team?
Is there a certain culture you're trying to develop?
Oh, you don't need to argue anymore. You can go with
No, but actually though.
Well, think about it, say, in a very long sales cycle, highly complex deal, where it's team-based and there's not a lot of rewards potentially until a year, 2, maybe even 3 years out.
Right. So we found out sales contests are not effective for doing that. Sales contests, they're not good for developing long-term development skills such as relationship building, for example. So sales contests would be your best option for that. Maybe a different compensation plan or team structure would be a better strategy.
Are sales contests more prominent or effective or ineffective in any specific industries that you guys come across? I don't really think we came across that research. I think they are widely used in a variety of businesses. I think primarily we're looking at B2B sales, not so much B2C. And actually, through our work, we discovered that perhaps it's not so much through CPGs, because CPGs usually have a very established structure with the retailer. So they would have a key account manager just go in, and they're responsible for their account. But here we're rather looking at when you have multiple competitors towards a specific retailer or whatnot. And then you have to perhaps win a bid and whatnot. So it's a more of a competitive landscape where you would want to use sales contests to kind of hope to motivate your salespeople to kind of maybe put in more effort, and hopefully with that extra effort they can do better for your company.
another question. I'm tying in the social media a little bit here as well from earlier presentation. When you run a sales contest, if you were the sales manager, would you be comfortable with the details of that sales compensation making your way through social media?
Like, probably. Because what this is it's you're running a sales contest for the purpose of increasing your company's competitive level against your competitors. And if your competitors know kind of when you're running a sales contest, maybe they run their own sales contest or run other mitigation ways, methods to like counteract that sales contest. Because at the end of the day, you're running a sales contest in order to drive sales or drive leads or whatever. And if you tip off your competitors in what you're doing, then I guess the effectiveness of the contest or whatever mechanism you're using might be diminished.
We did find it, however, it was really beneficial to promote it within the company because it really promotes the objectives you're trying to get across, who's the prize winner, and it sees, it lets the salespeople know where they're in competition with the other sales reps.
Thank you.
Sorry, just a question about one of your numbers. You said it was 227% better at generating leads than other social media platforms. Was it specific to any platform, or like was it just Facebook, Twitter, or was it all of them combined? Just curious.
Yeah, so they looked at all, I think they looked at 3 other social media platforms. It was Facebook, Twitter, and something else. And they just found that, compared to LinkedIn, there was basically no reason for using those other platforms in sales. So that's why we focused on LinkedIn.
Was it on an individual basis, or was it like aggregate?
On an individual basis, compared to LinkedIn with each one.
So I guess within LinkedIn, are there any sort of other applications that you would use, so what I'm saying is, like, if you log into LinkedIn, like, what is the salesperson actually doing? Are they just sending a direct message? Are they just requesting to connect? Like, what is that person actually doing?
Yeah, like there's definitely a lot of tools that you can do. And basically, from our sales rep that we talked to at Xerox, the way he utilizes LinkedIn is he basically starts off his day, he checks his emails and stuff like that, then he goes to LinkedIn, and basically it allows him to make his connections with other people in his industry. And then with that though, if he has a potential sale, it allows them to do pre-record information, but then also it allows you to kind of make more connections with people in the industry. So like we mentioned in the video, in the civil case, the Carmen guy, he basically didn't realize that the client that he was going after was actually had mutual connections with clients they already had. So LinkedIn is good for something like that. In addition to this, Xerox is a global company, and LinkedIn allows you to also stay in connection with people within your company. So there's people, that work in his office, and also people from the U.S. And LinkedIn also allows you to stay connected with people there.
LinkedIn offers some other cool modules like groups, things like that, and those can definitely be utilized by salespeople for organizational purposes. But basically, using LinkedIn in the traditional way is a good way for salespeople to.
Yeah, we just mentioned like something we found that we thought was cool, but didn't really fit with ours was a program called ExecNote, and it was where you could. It's sort of like a plugin for LinkedIn where you can record personalized 1-minute videos to send somebody, and like the individual we spoke to said like he had 100% success rate in opening these videos, so like, it was another really good way to connect with people on LinkedIn.
Good.
What are the disadvantages to using LinkedIn, if any?
Yeah, we actually looked at that, and we mentioned it in our video at the end of it, but there were a couple disadvantages, and these were actually told to us by our sales rep. So basically, one of the ideas most people have is that if you have LinkedIn, you're going to spend all your time on it all day. So although through our findings, most people only use 5% to 10% of their time on LinkedIn, so that's not too bad. There are chances that there are some people who will abuse this and waste some time. Another thing is just poorly representing yourself, and that's why we
said, training people on the use of LinkedIn is very important. So some people just might not use the resource properly, and then they'll just have a poor LinkedIn page, and this will just look bad. And then lastly, something that we talked about in this class, LinkedIn is great for recruiting, and we mentioned it last class that if you're a salesperson and you need a new salesperson, the best way to do it is to go through LinkedIn and find someone who already has a job. But the thing is, that could also be a negative for your current employer. So our sales rep, for instance, he's getting emails constantly and being connected through LinkedIn from people trying to hire him. So a disadvantage of LinkedIn is you might lose your sales force through other connections. So that's.
Yeah, you guys say that training is really important. What type of training is being suggested? Is it just the basics of how to use LinkedIn, or kind of more specific?
Yeah, the other group touched on this really well, but it's kind of the training that we talked about is really educating people that are not experienced in LinkedIn or using social media at all. So the focus for people that already know about LinkedIn, people like us who are entering Salesforce, would be on using it properly, because we might have some preconceived notions about how it works. But I don't think the value needs to be communicated to us as much as it needs to be communicated to people who right now have a traditional way of selling and don't think LinkedIn might be important for their process. So using some of the statistics we showed in the video could obviously be helpful for communicating that value, but also really communicating them how it will improve their lead generation and how that helps them align with the sales process.
Can you comment on it? For lots of people, they utilize a customer relationship management tool to maintain relationships. And that's one of the premises of why CRM, as we heard earlier, is valuable. Can you make the connection between these two for me? Is this a threat to CRM, or what's the relationship between the two?
I think you could use it to create synergies with CRM. As far as a threat, if you're looking at it from a CRM perspective, CRM is a lot more than just what LinkedIn does. So LinkedIn would be something that could complement CRM by providing information about things that are outside your company. So you could definitely use the resources available on LinkedIn to boost your customer relationship.
Yeah, I don't think it's a threat. I think they're kind of compatible. And like we mentioned in the video, there's roughly 260 million people on LinkedIn. So it's just like an additional resource with more people, more connections, more leads.
One more follow-up on that. I can't remember if you guys said it. Did you say LinkedIn is like a professional Google?
Yeah.
And I've heard it's like a professional Facebook as well. What advice do you have for a salesperson in terms of keeping LinkedIn purely for professional purposes versus personal purposes? And what are the risks to them in doing so? Like, for example, what if they were to get fired from their company?
As a result of using LinkedIn for kind
No,
of...
just in terms of it being their professional reputation.
So you're talking about how they would use LinkedIn after leaving?
Well, the idea around, if it's some people call it my professional resume, so to speak. Yeah. And then if I'm using it for business purposes, and something not positive happens to me, is the second part of that question, it could be a bit of an issue. Like, if I'm the company who fired you, what don't I want? I don't want you saying you work for me anymore.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, to get to the first part of that question, where you meant like, how can you make sure that they're not using it as like a professional Facebook necessarily?
I guess let me start all over.
Yeah,
I think maybe I was way too confused. Do you think for salespeople, or advice you have for a salesperson, should they treat LinkedIn as their own personal tool, pay for it, control it all themselves, or should it be company sponsored?
I think anything you're using, anything you're using on company time to conduct business for the company needs to be considered part of company business. So, as we mentioned in the video, the company needs to be specific about the strategy they're implementing with LinkedIn. So they need to be clear to the salespeople about what they're trying to accomplish with LinkedIn, and clear about how the salespeople should be using LinkedIn. And I think that touches on your point of whether it should be used for personal purposes. Obviously, they still have the option to use it for personal reasons, but they need to understand that there's the professional aspect to it, so maybe they would create two accounts or something like that.
create 2 accounts on LinkedIn, you get paid off. Just as a fact.
Sorry, say that again?
If you create 2 accounts on LinkedIn, then one of them off.
I guess just to comment further on that, basically, the idea that we had is like if Xerox implements, a company-wide spread LinkedIn for the sales force, and we want to train them in a way that make sure that they use it in the way that Xerox specifically wants them to use it. So we do believe that if the sales force is using LinkedIn, it should be done in a way that the company specifies and manages and monitors it properly within their kind of regulations.
And then, yeah, we also had the guy we were talking to at Xerox voiced some concerns over whether salespeople kind of get poached on LinkedIn, so that's kind of a personal thing. And obviously, those are things the company has to look at before they implement that strategy.
Okay. All right, fabulous.
If you guys want, we can start off. If anyone has any general questions about compensation and compensation and sales team within the CPG industry, before we start the video, we can start with that as well.
Oh, I like that. Let's start with the questions. Beautiful. Okay, Andrew, start us off.
Do you find more individual-based or team-based?
So it really depends on what you're selling. Within the CPGs, it is more team-based. Although you have team accounts, or key accounts, with your specific retailers, your compensation is mostly based on your salary with a limited number of bonuses and extended compensation in that sense. We did some research at OC into some untraditional CPGs such as Labatt, and they kind of focus on more of a meritocracy format where they do put more towards bonus and individual incentives on your performance rather than your base salary pay. Without giving too much away, that's kind of where we sit on that. Do you have anything else to add? Anyone else? Oh.
One of the things I hear a lot about with compensation is the importance of effective communication to follow compensation. Can you guys talk to me about the challenges when setting up a new compensation system?
Well, in speaking with Harvey Carroll, the one major thing he said was that communication is the biggest thing, and that if employees don't know what they're being assessed on, then how can you expect them to perform? So in terms of overcoming that, I think there needs to be frequent interactions between the manager and the employees so they always know what's going on and what they're being assessed on, and making sure that's aligned with the objectives of the company, which we're going to touch on.
Monetary components of compensation.
Yes.
Well, give me some examples of like non-monetary incentives that you would use in like that kind of environment.
It's coming right up in the video actually. But just briefly to touch on it, there's 3 non-monetary components that were recently discussed in a TED Talk video: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So those are 3 things that don't involve monetary compensation, but more so autonomy. So giving yourself like more power, more freedom to kind of work from home or do whatever you want. And then mastery is being an expert at your own field and really feeling like you own it. And then purpose is making sure that what you're doing is actually significant and having an impact in your environment.
Great job, guys. I like the line of treating employees equally is actually unfair. I'm curious as to see if the companies that are more variable pay-based translate into higher turnover. So like Labatt's, for example, they fire more employees versus like a more farmer-based.
Yeah, I think it's a balance of the two. Like if you're looking at the high variable pay companies like Labatt, they're obviously going to reward on the most performance and best performance that you get out of your sales team, and it's also increase the competitiveness within that sales team. So you're going to see, optimal changes of levels of sales for these individuals. But at the same time, to kind of touch on the turnover part, you see a lot of people from the CPG industry where it's mostly salary, it's very secure, not a lot of risk based on your bonuses. If they're really good and good salespeople, they're going to go over to where they can make more money based on their opinion. So that's kind of the turnover aspect. Yeah.
Do you find that the compensation package and like within these companies varied based on their like sales employees? For example, like the 40-year-old person with a family got a different compensation package than somebody who's like young 22-year-old.
Yeah, definitely. The one thing we found that as you climb the ranks, your objectives and what you're evaluated on definitely changes. So as you become more of a senior manager, you're evaluated more on, I guess, the performance of your subordinates and I guess the establishing of relationships and more of the qualitative aspects. Whereas when you're just like an account manager, then you're just kind of out there grinding and getting the numbers and hitting your objectives.
In terms of age too, just to add on to that, you see the people that are a little older, they have a family, they want to secure income, that's when they kind of gravitate towards that CPG industry where there is more of a salary base and security. Whereas if you're young, you can be on the road out and fishing for the most business you can, you want to be one of those hunters in the barrel-based pay, which is normally in pharmaceuticals or tech companies. Yep.
Do you think that the performance-based pay actually has impact on people like salespeople focusing on short-term sales rather than building relationships?
I think it definitely can, and that's why you need to be so careful and constantly revisiting your compensation plan to make sure that it's aligned with your company objectives, and always be monitoring and changing it to reflect your needs of the business, so you're not just short-sighted and you're actually looking in the long term at what's best for your company.
Also, we found it depends on the length of the buying process or the selling process, right? So traditionally, if you're going to look long-term and you're involved in those longer or elongated selling processes, you're going to be put in it and make sure that you do your due diligence along the way to make sure the end result, maybe it's a year down the road, is the best one for the company. Any other questions?
Just building on Tanner's question, you see the emergence of flexible compensation systems that allow the individual salesperson to choose what they want from a selection of components. What do you think of that? What do you think of the risks? What do you think of the benefits to it?
In terms of flexibility, it's not one of the things we looked into because it's not really prominent within the CPG industry for their compensation plans. One thing we did touch on though, for the non-monetary incentives, like we'll touch on in the video there, your sales manager, your superior, is going to build those into your contract based on what they see is most important to you. So where you may not have your optimal choice of what you're getting, they're going to try and base those non-monetary incentives around what's most important.
Okay. Final question for me. You mentioned the importance of monitoring. And so that suggests you have some systems in place that allow you to capture whatever it is you want to monitor. Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of systems you saw, or maybe the lack thereof, what kinds of issues that presents?
Okay, so basically, in terms of measuring success of your sales team, that's what we're getting at here. One of the things, again, we touched on in the video was that you have to constantly revisit and align what you're rewarding based on the company goals. So one thing in the case study we looked at was in the past, we're talking 20 years ago, Kraft actually did reward their salespeople based on the amount of tons that they sold to their retailers. So something with low margins that weighs heavy, like a glass bottle of mayonnaise, they're going to push that through the supply chain as quick as they can to get it to the retailer so that they can get rewarded on their end. But the company wasn't aligning that with what they want, which is high profitability. So they were kind of pushing in the background the high profitable items such as Kool-Aid, which is back 20 years ago was in the packets, sugar and flavor. So I think in terms of aligning that,
Final questions?
Yep. In terms of, I guess, all-in comp, you're looking at base and then the commission, like, what was like the CPG company that were highest? Was there any specific one that stood out in terms of
Well, in terms of standing out, I think Labatt definitely stood out because most companies in CPG specific, like we showed, they're predominantly based with a small salary or a small commission base or commission aspect to it. But with Labatt, their idea is that reward your best people and don't reward your average people, which I think is a very contemporary view on things because they don't want just the average people. They want people that are going to go and they're going to increase the sales and be as profitable as possible. So I think Labatt was probably the most unique in terms of their compensation plans.
Yeah, how Harvey Carroll put it, which was our main contact in terms of Labatt's practices, was when he was interviewing people, if he brought that up and that's how they were rewarded and they were kind of skittish or they didn't really respond well to that, he simply said that maybe this isn't the industry or the job for you. If you're not motivated and you're not confident in yourself to gain the sales and to get compensated based on variable pay, then maybe you're not going to work out at the moment. Yep.
Have you seen this type of structure of variable pay hurt team morale? I think if I was working on that and then Taylor was also working there, I'd probably correct that.
Um,